All right. Uh, if you have been paying attention to any of these videos, you may have noticed that I'm getting quieter and quieter over time. Turns out, what's been happening is that there's a knob on this microphone that I have not really paid much attention to, that I've been bumping inadvertently here and there. And it turns out it actually does something. And I was trying to figure out what the sound issue was, and condescended to reading the manual and found what the issue was. So I put the gain back up. Hopefully this sounds better, all that good stuff. So thank you for bearing with me. I'm sorry. Apparently you can't go back and fix the gain on a video that's already been uploaded. I'm not going to reshoot some of that stuff. It just takes too long. Um, anyway, today I want to talk about something that's really contentious, and that would be gun control. Ooh. Especially in the group that I tend to talk with about this subject. I am definitely in the minority in my opinions about this. Um, and while this does not, this confuses people, I think, in that group sometimes because they're so used to that being associated with a number of other political opinions um, that I do not actually hold. Uh, the Second Amendment to me is very much a fundamental right that is often misunderstood as to why it was there. Right now, I understand. I understand completely why the concern about gun control and guns in general in America. Right, other countries do not experience the level of gun violence that we do because they are not armed like we are. But I would say that the corollary to that is that we don't consider police oppression and government oppression as part of our gun violence statistics either. You just have to do what they say or else. And if you're a criminal, you don't have a weapon, or you do, and then you're really a criminal and they will gun you down, right? So, but I'm going to start here. Uvalde school shooting in 2022, May, I believe. It was end of the school year, near the end of the school year. Uvalde is a town in Texas where they are very gun happy. If you ever meet anyone from Texas, a lot of times they're wilder than most about their firearm enthusiasm. Um, and Uvalde is a small town, and a school shooter entered the grounds and started killing people. Okay, police showed up within 3 minutes originally, first response, but that man wandered the halls of that building shooting people for an hour and 15 minutes before, of all people, Border Patrol entered there and finally stopped him because he was holed up in some sort of uh, closet or whatever. Now, a lot of crazy misinformation and all these other things were happening about that incident, but what we can divine from it after reading tea leaves, according to the Wikipedia, and I will warn you that the Wikipedia is monitored heavily for current events by paid actors to make sure that every story stays in a certain frame. So take everything you read on the Wikipedia, despite its democratic nature, with a big old grain of salt. My experience has been, if you go back more than 100 years to read about political scandals and such, it gets a lot more objective. But anything current is going to have a slant. So keep that in mind. Whether or not you agree with the slant or not, a slant nonetheless. Okay. But anyway, um, using it as a relatively objective source, basically what happened is one police department showed up, another police department showed up, and a third police department showed up, and all of them surrounded and cordoned off this school, but wouldn't actually enter the grounds themselves. Now, parents were receiving texts and they were hearing about what was going on, and they ran down to see what had happened to their kids, and some of them wanted to just go in there and get them. And the police, and there are plenty of videos of this, turned around and stopped these angry citizens from storming that place to save their children. One man, who was a Border Patrol agent himself, actually commandeered his barber's shotgun and went in there and started saving kids. Now, the rumor was that he had saved his own child. I'm not sure if that was true. He did not gun down the shooter. It was officials that finally did that. But he had broken through the lines to do what needed to be done because the police weren't doing it. And the police were, in fact, preventing parents who did not have the equipment that these people did to try to put their own lives on the line to do what it would take to get their kids out. And there is a valid argument to be made that you don't want people rushing the scene and all that other stuff. But they stood around for an hour and 15 minutes while this guy was going to town on their children and the faculty of the school. And after all the investigations, of course, what happened was everybody pointed fingers at each other, said everybody else was at fault for lack of communication or whatever. And the people who were in trouble continue to be or the people in charge continue to be active in places of authority, and some of them got moved around and continue to this day to act in official capacities, even after such an incredible blunder. Because here's the thing. Columbine happened in 1999. Okay, I was out of school by then, but these kinds of things didn't happen. Columbine caught everyone off guard, of course, but we've had more than 2 decades now for police departments and such to develop protocols. The schools have protocols. The school, a lot of the teachers did, in fact, follow the proper protocol to try to protect their kids. You know, it's not a perfect thing, but they had something to follow. And it feels to me that an hour and 15 minutes sure feels like way too long now to know how to deal with a shooter that won't negotiate, right? But it was the first time I ever saw an interesting conversation come up. It's a conversation that has always been on the mind of people that I know, where both people on the left and people on the right, moderates, in fact, started to ask this question. If we're spending all this money, and Uvalde's police department was very well heeled considering the size of their community, if we're spending all this money to buy the best tactical gear and the best equipment and all these guns and all these other things for our local constabulary to protect us, and when it comes to something like this, they won't go in there to save the lives of children, what is all this equipment actually for? Now, of course, you can't expect someone to be brave, okay? That is fair. The people will go off about the school, you know, the police officer in the school or whatever, and I think there was some charges that were made against those guys about failing to protect the kids. I don't know if that's really all that fair necessarily, because they were out of their element. You know, they were there to keep the peace. Okay. I will argue there that they are police officers, they are peace officers, and they're there to make sure that kids are not acting out of control. You know, so when a wild gunman comes flying through the door and starts mowing people down, in the moment of truth, not every person will stand up to it, no matter how well you train. And while I can say I'm disappointed, perhaps, I can't say I'm terribly surprised. And I think that they're an unfair scapegoat for the level of escalation that happened. Okay, okay, but that's up to a jury and a judge to decide. I'm not going to really weigh in too heavily on that. I just think that there should be a little bit of mercy levered out, considering the nature of the situation. But when we're talking about 100 or so armed, you know, prepared soldiers, we'll call them, because that's kind of what they turn into when these events happen, why they're not going in there and taking care of business when this guy is not going to negotiate. I understand all the other stuff too. You got to worry about the hostages and everything else. But imagine this. I want you to think about this. I want you to think about it real hard, especially if you have children. Imagine getting a text from your child saying there's someone in here with a gun and they're shooting people. And you get that text and you run down to the schools immediately as fast as you can. And you're texting back and forth with your kid. You know, hide, stay safe, or whatever, I'm coming. And you run to the school and the police are stopping you from doing anything. And they're just standing around, and they're standing around for a long time. You're going to get mad as hell. And then you find out when you start sending those texts, you're not getting a response back. And you keep texting, tell me you're okay. Tell me you're okay. And they're not okay. And you find out that in between the time that you got there trying to get in there to help, watching the police stand around. During that window of time, your child was killed by that man because he had free reign to do whatever he wanted while they tried to figure out what to do. It happened to some people, and the police actively prevented them from intervening when they wouldn't intervene themselves. It would be far more understandable if they were like, ma'am, you got to stay back. You got to stay right here because we got guys in there right now and we don't want you getting in there and getting in the line of fire. Okay. Let the professionals take care of it. We're on it. We're on it. That would be one thing. Wait. We're figuring out what to do. We're waiting for the officials. We're waiting for more gear. That was the big one. What do you want, a tank? You know, it's not. It's hard to know what to do with the situation, but I will say that they should have protocols by now. So if we're buying all this gear for the police and they're not willing to use it to help us, if they're not using it for us, it begs the question, what do they intend to use it for? Back in 2010 or so, I was at a festival. In October, they have a thing called Salmon Days in this town called Issaquah that I was living in. And it's one of those towns on the fringes of Seattle, like many find that get absorbed by the sprawl, where you have a little main street and old storefronts that they've gentrified and decorated to look all nostalgic, and then giant strip malls down the road, and huge swaths of homes, all on curved community streets and busy boulevards as people are heading to on the freeway or to the park and rides to get to their job that's many miles away that many of us could do from home. Another argument, whole other subject there. But it's what's called a bedroom community. It's very small in terms of its population considering its size, and it's very affluent because of the nature of the people who live there. They're all professionals of some sort. Most of them are. And so our police department is well heeled. They have all really good stuff. They have really cool cars. They have all the best gear. They have really fancy uniforms, all that other stuff, considering the size of the town. But at the Salmon Days Festival that year, when you go walking past the city hall, this is where the police department and the city hall both operate out of the same building. You're walking past the city hall, and the cops are standing in front of this new vehicle they've got. And boy, are they proud of it. They love it. There are a couple of them just standing there. It is an armored personnel carrier. Now, I'm not a military guy. I'm not familiar with models and all these other things, but I am roughly familiar with what the function of these vehicles are. They're this kind of an angular vehicle with all this armor plating on the side and these really tough, heavy tread tires. 6 of them, as far as I could tell, more than 4. Okay. Meant to go over rough terrain or whatever. It's a military vehicle. And it's armored against random gunfire or whatever. It can probably even take small explosives and all that other stuff, right? And I saw this thing. And the cops are standing in front of it. They're talking to people, and little boys are running up. Wow, truck. It's all black, and it's got the Issaquah Police Department logo on the side. And they're bragging about it. And I go up and listen to the police officer talking about this vehicle that they've got. And he mentions the following concerning phrase. This can deploy 12 of us into a live fire environment safely. My local constabulary now has a vehicle where 12 of them can arm themselves to the teeth and drive up into a live fire environment feeling safe and then deploy themselves. So I asked this police officer, what scenario in the city of Issaquah do you envision having to use this vehicle to deploy 12 police officers into a live fire environment? Now, he missed the point of what I was saying because then he went on about police safety and, protecting the communities and all this other stuff. But what it occurs to me is if you have something like this and feel the need to put 12 men into this thing, or women, into this thing, and ride into a live fire environment and deploy them in some fashion, or maybe even fire from within the vehicle. I don't know how you would use it, honestly. That feels to me not like a normal crime that's underway, but some sort of insurrection, some sort of rebellion, maybe. So if that is what's going on, I don't think I want you having that vehicle, flat out, because the police are not soldiers. The police are meant to keep the peace. They're meant to engage with, and don't get me wrong, okay? I want to be very clear. I feel for the police too. They've got a hard job. They've got a very hard job. But I don't want them doing stuff like that. That is stuff for the National Guard. If you have a situation where you need to deploy 12 soldiers into a live fire environment, that is something that needs to be escalated to a different kind of personnel than the same people who are taking reports over stolen cars and dealing with drunks on the street. Now, I know that that's not all they deal with. My father probably did because he was a lazy cop in and not a very kind of a dirty cop in a very sleepy town. So he never had to face any of that stuff, but got the prestige of being an officer anyway. But I do know that they go through stuff. I was witness to this motorcycle accident where this kid was flying along on his rocket bike, and he's going way too fast trying to go in front of this car through a roundabout, and he wasn't fast enough, and he clipped the front of this car, and he spun out and slid across the road 30-40 feet, man. And I saw that, I was like, oh my god, this kid is dead or hurt badly, you know. And I called 911, and the police come out, you know, and they'd know there were a couple of people that had called on it because they'd seen it too, so I wasn't the only one. But this kid, very fortunately, very fortunately, got up and dusted himself off. You know, he had a good leather outfit on and a helmet and all that other stuff. So it was a wipeout, but he managed to walk away from it. And so after I gave the police officer this statement, this police officer had a scar across his mouth too. This guy had been through something, I think. You know, he seemed to show the wounds to prove it. Now it could have been some sort of just home accident, I suppose, but it sure made him look tough. But he felt tough too, talking to him. And so he pulled me away from the rest of the scene to get my statement because I had seen it probably the most clearly of anyone because I was in the car right behind him when I saw it. And he took my statement, and he finally said, you know, fortunately he's okay, you know. And I said, I swear to God, man, I thought he was really hurt. I thought he was really hurt. And this guy turns and looks at me and he says, you have no idea how lucky he is because I've seen it turn out a lot worse. And I said, I bet you have. You know, these guys go through crazy stuff. They see horrible things all the time. Same police. I've been stopped in the middle of traffic by a bunch of cops jumping out of their cars, chasing somebody down the riverbed with their guns drawn, you know, going after somebody that's on the run. And I saw them running through traffic in my car. And I'm like, should I be concerned? And they're like, stay in your car. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to hide behind the engine block, right? As best I can to make myself small, you know. Stuff goes down, that's true. It really is. Nothing that requires an armored personnel carrier, though, I would venture. We're seeing the opposite problem now with ICE. Immigrations and customs enforcement officials drafted off the street with large chunks of money that is way more than we pay for teachers and doctors and stuff in this country to go rustle illegal immigrants out of their communities. Now, I do support the idea of enforcement. That's where a lot of contention lies. I'm not a big fan of a bunch of people living here that aren't supposed to, you know. And I feel like if you know that you're having to live off the grid, you know you're not supposed to be here. It's that simple. If you can't not steal somebody's social security number or whatever to get a job, or completely work under the table and have to get prepaid cards and prepaid cell phones and all that other stuff, I think you know you're not supposed to be here. It shouldn't be this difficult for you, you know. And I know that people feel strongly the other way, but I think that on the surface, you can support that and not be a complete zealot. I certainly don't support the way they're doing it, though, where you're not even just violating constitutional rights, you're violating like Geneva Convention stuff. They're just grabbing people out of the street, kicking in doors with no warrants or some blanket warrant or whatever. They just grab whoever that happens to look a certain way, throw them in a truck, and drive off with them, and God knows where. This is Gestapo level stuff, you know? So while I support the idea of enforcement, I don't support the way that they're going about it. And you listen to these people talk or type or whatever, and they talk about what's going on in these places as if it was a war zone. Talking about urban cells and spotters and such. Why do they talk like this? Because they are soldiers. They are not police officers. This is the problem we had in Iraq and Afghanistan. You put a bunch of soldiers out there and tell them to keep the peace, and lots of innocent people get mown down and generates resentment from the populace. They are not police officers. They are not peace officers. They are soldiers. Their job is to combat an enemy who is actively firing back at them for the purposes of occupation at the highest. They're guards and soldiers. Police officers are different. They have to deal with the citizenry. They have to deal with squabbles and, mitigate, escalating violence and deal with minor issues and stuff like that to keep the peace for the community, so that you have a general sense of justice in the community and people feel safe, and everyday justice is carried out. It's not always perfect for them. It's not always perfect for the soldiers, but they are two different functions. And it's the reason why we have a constitutional separation of the military that says they should not have a standing army in the United States. We're supposed to have a National Guard, I guess. I'm not sure how I feel about that, because they can be commandeered by the federal government. And likewise, part of the reason why all these police departments are getting all this militarized gear is because they want to be able to be commandeered to improve their ranks in the case of some sort of civil unrest. No one's invading the United States. I promise you that. The Japanese made that very clear. One of their admirals said, we can't take the continental United States, because behind every blade of grass there'll be a rifle. We are armed to the teeth here. And nothing would make us band together more than an invading foreign army. Doesn't matter who you are. We're all probably going to stand side by side. Hippie versus conservative, ultra right wing Christian psycho. Both brothers in arms in that scenario, I would imagine. That's not what this stuff is for. This stuff is for what was happening in Minnesota, where these soldiers are being deployed against the populace, and the populace is getting pissed off. I thought very seriously that the National Guard was going to stand against ICE. Now, of course, the National Guard is a government is a state agency. And if that had happened, we'd been in real trouble. That is the silver lining, I think, of Alex Peretti's death. God rest him. But it was only after his death that everybody kind of took a breath and go, whoa, we're getting carried away here. But it could have been an open warfare between the armed civilians, even maybe, and immigrations and customs enforcement. That's what this stuff has been escalating to, because they are a standing army within the shores of the United States. That is how I view them anyway. They sure look like soldiers. You drop them into any combat zone around the world, they'd seem right at home there. But they're here. The reason Alex Peretti got shot is because he had a weapon on him. He didn't brandish it at them, but they're trained that as soon as they see a weapon, that is an enemy combatant, and that man needs to be dropped. That's why he died. Plain and simple. They weren't going to respect his Second Amendment rights. They're not trained to. They didn't have rights in Iraq. You came upon a soldier with a gun, you're down, man. That's how it worked for them. That's why they react that way. That's why they react that way in a lot of ways, where they're acting like it's a video game. These guys are traumatized. They have been taught that human life has little value, especially if they're on the other side of their barrel. And yet we've recruited them and deployed them here. And as much as I have a distaste for people who are here illegally, they are not soldiers and they are not an invading force. They're still civilians. When people talk about gun control, they talk about things like the Uvalde school shooting, and they want to know where they got that gun. Invariably, they got the gun from someone they stole it from. Almost always. It's very rarely their own gun that they went through the process of purchasing. They get their hands on it from a family member or whatever. They know that it's there. They figure out a way to get at it, and they take it, or they get it stolen off the street or whatever. You get it from somewhere they're not supposed to get it from most of the time. Sometimes they get it from like a gun show or something like that where it's kind of shady. There's probably some criminal activity going on there. So I don't think that you would say that these are law abiding ways to obtain these weapons in the first place. Okay. Now, that does not invalidate the fact that they got their hands on them. That's true. But they are in the act of committing crimes when they then elevate the level of that crime. It is horrible that people get killed. I agree. I hate that it happens. And sometimes the conversation comes down to what was going on in their head, what was wrong with them. And you see these guys and they're not there, to put it mildly. Okay. If they actually get caught and aren't just gunned down, there's something going on with them. But I will say this too, though. This stuff did not happen when I was younger. It did not happen when I was in school. We talk about it a lot. People, those that are past a certain age, we never had gun drills and stuff like that. We had nuclear bomb drills. that was that's a little scary. Hey, when you're staring outside and suddenly the light of 1,000 suns starts searing your eyes, stop, drop, and get under the desk. You're not surviving that. Anybody who did any basic research into that, even as a kid, you're like, I don't think this school's going to survive it when you look at what happens in these tests. But we didn't have this issue. It just never happened. Pearl Jam sang a song about Jeremy, the kid who comes into school who's really upset about his life and opens fire either on himself or on others. I'm not sure what the context of that is. I think it was about a true story. But this was a moving song to us because why would you do that? That sort of thing never happened. And it's not to say that gun violence didn't occur. We had gang warfare and stuff in LA, but people wandering into a school and shooting children was beyond the pale. It just never happened. I don't know why that is. People could have, but they just didn't do it. And of course, there are some that point to SSRIs and all the deployment of all these weird medications to people starting in the 90s as perhaps being a factor. But the thing is that argument gets invalidated right away from gun control advocates because they feel like they're deflecting the issue. I think it's worth a talk, though. What has changed since 1999 that predicates us on these events? Now, one of the ones I think is also worthy of talking about is the school shootings. When they happen, they're big news. Everybody wants to know what's going on. And if you want to go down in a blaze of infamy, it's a way to do it because the cameras will be on you 24/7. We didn't have a CNN back before 1992 or whatever. So the opportunity to get this kind of broadcast of your infamy was not really possible. In any event, there's lots of factors, I think, to why people do this stuff. And of course, how they do it is because they have more access to firearms here than most other countries. But again, I will remind you, they don't have civilian gun violence. They just have oppression of their governments. People just have to do what their government says or face the ultimate price because they have no way to defend themselves. First time I ever heard a gun control argument, interestingly enough, was on the Sir Mix-a-Lot album, Mac Daddy. The last song on there is called No Holds Barred. And of course, Sir Mix-a-Lot comes from my neck of the woods, and despite my rocker status, uh, we'd listen to that stuff on the sly because it was kind of cool, especially because we knew the neighborhoods he was talking about. You know, he was talking about rolling through SeaTac and picking up girls and stuff like that. You know, so that's kind of novel. He lived in the Central District. You'd see him drive around from time to time, you know, in his green and yellow cars. They were ugly as sin, but you knew who it was. He even had a license plate. Mix-a-Lot. Now, I'm not sure he did even any of the things that he sings about. A lot of this kind of songs that come out. But in that song in particular, what he's talking about is he had a he had been, according to the song, I'm just quoting the song, he had been selling weed, and so the dope smokers knew that he had a little bit of money, and he had a guy break into his house one night, and he beat him within an inch of his life because he was in his house. You know, now of course the premise is he was being a criminal in the first place, and it's criminals being criminals to criminals, whatever. But he had to go to court in the song, and he has to go to court and explain his actions because he got carried away beating this guy, you know, within an inch of his life. And he pleads guilty because he's like, I'm not going to stand down and tell you that I didn't do it. This guy was in my house. And he suffered whatever consequences of that. Maybe a true story. I don't know. I haven't looked into it that deeply. But he says, the problem now is you have crack cocaine on the streets. And people are wild on this stuff. And it's as addictive as, say, heroin, where people will do anything to get their next fix. But this is cocaine we're talking about. So people are hyperactive on this stuff looking for their next fix. So they don't, you can't stop these guys when they're crazy. You can't beat these people up. They are still flying at you no matter their injuries. And his point there is that the only way to stop them is with a gun. And they get very creative and they get very violent in trying to rob people to find either the drug they're looking for or something to finance their next fix. And of course, then he talks about gun control in general. So the thing is I need to be able to protect my house. I need to be able to protect myself. Because I've also had, in the song, some organized crime organization come and clean out my mother's house. Somebody came along at some point and actually like really went after all that stuff in there. And the cops laughed at him. They're like, well, you are what you are. We think you're a bad guy. So we don't really give a shit anyway, while his mother's crying in the song. And so now he feels a real need to be able to protect her because it's her. It's his mom. And some serious thugs came in and took a bunch of stuff, whether they were crack addled or not. And so he's talking about, if the cops aren't going to help me, then I need to be able to protect myself. And that's why we have a Second Amendment. But now we have all these people, this is 1990 that he made this album, now we have all these people talking about gun control. He says, well, let's be hypothetical now. Okay? Gun control sweeps the nation. You cannot have a gun anymore. So now what you have are criminals with guns and cops with guns. And he's like, you can still get an AK on the street. That's been banned for years. So what's to stop the criminal from continuing to be armed? If I'm a law-abiding citizen and I'm not armed, now I'm just a sheep waiting for the slaughter. So I have to ask the police for help. But the police have made it clear to me they aren't all that willing to help me. His phrase is, it's hard for a brother to trust police. And having lived in this area for some years now, I know why. He says brothers, in the context as he's using it, don't trust police. I get why they don't. That particular dynamic has not changed. He's like, if you can't protect yourself, and the police won't, then it's open season on you. And so, of course, this finishes up, don't write notes to your legislator. Remember to vote and get these guys out, right? Now, he's talking about the self-defense issue, and that is an absolutely valid, 100% valid aspect of the Second Amendment. But we also have to deal with the idea that we may be in a situation where we have a military that is doing things that are unconstitutional to the point where enough of the community has had enough. No rebellion, no insurrection is legal. And I'll remind you that it was legal for the government to deploy thugs back during the strikebreaker days against the people who are just trying to fight for fair wages. They will send men to hurt and kill you if you upset the apple cart too much. We know this about our government. We tend to forget it. They're constantly telling us how they're doing it to protect us and first responders and their heroes and thank you for all your service and stuff like that. And most of those people are, I'm not going to say that they aren't valid points there, but they follow orders. And if those orders are things that are against the sensibilities of the people they're being executed against, what are you going to do if you don't have any weaponry to stop them? Now, the Bundy Ranch, back also in 2022, I believe, that one, the way that's painted to people is like, oh, those are just psychos. But what I will say is that the government was trying to take their land rights from them, and those people stood off against the government, and they were willing to martyr themselves for the cause and say, not this time. And the government stood down. That is what keeps the government at bay from doing what they do in places like Europe. Now, I know we look at their protests and see that they get out of control, and that's fun. Yay, they're standing up for pensions and stuff. But they also show up to your house if you posted something online that they didn't like. Just for posting a thing online. They don't have freedom of speech in the UK. It's a surveillance state there, baby. When you get out of line, cops are going to show up at your house and arrest you for the things you say. First time I ever saw workplace retaliation for political speech was in the wake of the Columbine shooting. Now, here's the thing about the Columbine guys, okay? I did not personally, but I knew them, I would say, in a cultural stance. They were outcasts. They listened to heavy metal and Marilyn Manson and all that stuff, who was unfairly blamed for that, How was he responsible? But they listen to this music. They role played and such. They wear black trench coats. I had a black trench coat in high school. I had long hair in high school. And the stuff they did is stuff that I could have done. I read the poor man's James Bond. I read the Anarchist Cookbook. I know the material that they were using to make the pipe bombs and such that they found on those guys. I know how to do it. Fight Club told me about how to make napalm out of orange juice. I already knew. Kitty litter works too. All sorts of things you can do with household products. Don't do stuff with household products. Do not create weaponry. Unless you absolutely need to, of course. But the point being, though, is that I identified with those guys a lot because I understood them. Now, I wouldn't have done what they did, but they were basically getting revenge. They were living out a revenge fantasy against the people they felt that was oppressing them, okay? Not that it's okay. I will never say that, of course not. But I understand why they did it. And a lot of us did that were computer nerds that had gotten jobs now. And we talked about it. We're like, yeah, man, that they called themselves the trench coat mafia, those two. Like, they look familiar to me. You know what I mean? And we had a bulletin board at work. And believe it or not, it was the internet, or it was before the internet, there was AIM and stuff like that. But we had an exchange server in our workplace, and we had an area for people to just shoot the breeze, and we had multiple buildings and stuff. And when we had time around, we'd read through this stuff and make jokes. And our memes were sound wave files. Instead of GIFs like they do now, we would have waves because GIFs were more expensive space wise, strangely enough. But one of the guys that I knew posted, he said, I would have been a member of the Trenchcoat Mafia. And a lot of us knew exactly what he meant. It's like those were kind of the guys that I was and hung out with. But someone saw that and got very upset because they thought he meant something else. And he got fired right there. And they just put a squash on that. You're not talking about this subject anymore. It's too political. It's upsetting to people, and you're going to get fired if you talk about this stuff. So he got fired for a misunderstanding, really, is how I view it. It was insensitive, maybe, but we were talking about it. It was on the news. And I understood exactly what he meant because that's kind of the same thing for me. Now, I would never have carried that far, of course. I have too much empathy. Those guys were clearly didn't have it all together. And I don't know what makes them different than me and the people I hung out with that made them so mentally deranged to think that that was the thing to do. Those of us though, we held out for the idea that one day this too shall pass, and we'll get out there. And that we keep being told by people, one day you'll be pumping the jock's gas, or the jock will be pumping your gas, right? Yeah, one day we'll get our revenge, the revenge of the nerds. But people getting in trouble for even commenting on stuff. That was something new. I'd never seen that before. And that happens too, even in this country. Now, of course, freedom of speech does not mean freedom from consequences. But I was operating under the illusion. 1999 was a hard year for me for breaking of the illusions. The WTO happened that year too. Also a reason why I support Second Amendment rights. Because I've seen government agents, when they're unleashed on the people who are just trying to speak out about the unfairness of all these backdoor deals being made about labor agreements and such, when no workers are at the table. They unleashed the dogs on us then too. Occupy, same thing. When we start talking about the money, the federal agents come out. And if they can't gas you, they'll get more violent. And people forget the reason we have a Second Amendment and a First Amendment and a Third Amendment and Fourth and Fifth is because of what was happening that led up to and in the wake of the Boston Massacre. We were printing stuff talking about how we don't like kings. We don't like this government anymore. They're taxing the hell out of us. And they're performing a kind of summary justice on us against the people who messed up that British East India Company vessel by destroying some of their trade value in protest of having to pay these ridiculous taxes on stuff. They took people's guns, as they do in most countries now. They took those guns away and said, you don't need to protect yourself. We'll protect you. Give me that gun. And they also busted up the printing presses. We don't like what you're saying. When you're not going to say it, we're going to destroy your livelihood. The people who ran those presses. And we're going to hurt anyone who starts talking like this. That's insurrection. Third Amendment, we're going to put a government minder in your home. A soldier, you have to house a soldier now. All of you. Every one of you have to take care of them, and they get to listen to everything you say. And Fourth Amendment, they get to dig through all your stuff if they want to, and call their bosses to do the same. And Fifth Amendment, if they don't like what they see, they can torture you into a confession. We have these rights in this country because of what governments do to people. And people forget that often the time, especially the Second Amendment. Yes, it is dangerous. There are guns around. I do not own any firearms. I will not say I don't own weapons. I just don't own firearms because they make me nervous. But I support everyone's right to own firearms, as many as they like, as long as they're responsible with them. As long as they keep them locked up and everything else. These are dangerous things. But yes, protecting yourself is dangerous. It's not a sword. It's not a bow and arrow. I know that. Those are harder to use and all that other stuff. But all throughout history, karate, the martial arts style I developed or learned was developed by people who'd had their weapons taken from them. They developed that style to deal with invaders that were well armed, well armored, well better fed usually, and larger, who would come in and oppress them. And the reason they used things like nunchucks and sai as part of the weapon training that you learn, the ninja weapons. A nunchuck is meant to flail rice. That's what it was, a rice flail. They'd pick up a peasant object and use it as a weapon against people. That's what that weapon is. A sai is meant to pick up bales of hay. They were wood. They weren't metal. Wood is not so great at stopping swords. It's a sword catcher, though. You can use it that way, especially if you make it tough enough. We learned how to use what were, in that particular society, ordinary implements that you would find laying around to defend yourself against people who had taken your weapons and were coming to take stuff from you. And do your best with what they've left you with. Argument was also made. Well, you can't use a rifle against an F-14 or whatever. Yes, that's true, but you can learn where the pilot of that F-14 lives, and that's part of why the Second Amendment exists. That sounds very scary and almost rebellious. I'm just pointing out that that's part of the issue. If you're an occupying military against an armed populace, it's hard for you to maintain control unless you're being civil to them and treating them right. It's a lot easier to control a population that's disarmed. Ask any conqueror, any oppressor. When you're talking about 1940s Germany, what did they do? They took away the weapons. You don't need that. We'll protect you. In Japan, same thing. 1837, the Meiji Restoration. You don't need any weapons. When they started to prepare for an invasion from the United States, though, they started teaching all the people that were left on those islands how to defend their homes with broomsticks and stuff. An invading military force with rifles and such is coming. Use a bucket and a mop to protect you and your family. When they knew on the flip side, if they tried to invade over here, they wouldn't have gotten very far. They wouldn't have got past the West Coast, I promise you that. Because we're armed. I know it sucks, man. I hate it when this stuff happens. I do. But we have to remember that, first of all, they are arming our local constabularies to have military grade equipment. And no one is stopping this. No one is looking at this and saying, this is a bad idea. Because one day, they're going to use it for what its intended purpose is. And if we're not prepared at least to defend ourselves, they're just going to steamroll everyone. Because left and right had a brief moment of clarity. They came together. And they asked themselves, if they're not going to protect the kids with all this stuff we're giving them, all this tax money that we pay for this government that's supposed to do stuff for us in this very specific acute instance of where we need them most, they're not willing to do what we expected them to do with all this stuff. It only follows it's not for that. And if we can't prevent them from doing that, arming themselves in that capacity, all we can do is prepare for the worst if and when it comes. So I know that, especially among this group, you don't see eye to eye with me on this particular subject. That's okay. It's part of the debate in the United States. Part of why we have a democracy is why we have free speech, all that other stuff. And I respect everyone else's opinion about it. I know I get where you're coming from. I do. I think the alternative, though, is much worse. Because I'm one of those people that would rather be dead on my feet than living on my knees.